on the imminent application of different types of trade-related climate measures, other measures to secure critical minerals and so on. And more broadly, we'll seek to advance the discussion on how to advance Africa's trade-related development competitiveness concerns. So also, I think it will be helpful if we can also keep in our minds the earlier discussion on WTO reform and the role of industrial policy as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rosalind Nguero from the AFCFTA Secretariat. We're really, really delighted that you could join us, Rosalind. So it would be great if you could explain to the audience, not everyone here may be knowledgeable, fully knowledgeable on what you're trying to advance at the AFCFTA in terms of integrating climate and sustainability objectives, as well as the interaction with the African Green Industrialisation Initiative. So I'll welcome you to provide perhaps some introductory remarks, just kind of setting the context and helping everyone to understand the interaction between these two important initiatives. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jody. And thank you once again to the team that invited us to speak at this event. The question that you have asked really goes to the heart of Africa's development, the development future, whether climate ambition becomes a constraint to our growth or it becomes a catalyst for our industrial transformation. So the core issue is simple. And we started the conversation this morning, part of it. Compliance without investment will marginalize Africa's exports. But integration plus investment can turn climate action into competitiveness. So we need to turn now the competitiveness tool to reflect what we are doing in climate. So we should not talk climate versus development, but we talk about how climate can actually support and transition the continent in the development process. So that is really the key message that I would want to share as an introductory part. Then I will make my interventions in 4 parts based on what you have asked. So how are we integrating climate and sustainability in the AFCFTA, not just in the protocol on investment, but across all the protocols that we saw as well. And then how does the AGII then complement this work that we are doing at the continental level on AFCFTA trade and investment discussion and rulemaking, and some of the challenges that would then be faced currently at the global level based on the climate discussions that are ongoing, and how we work together with the AGII now practically to speak in one voice. So on AFCFTA and climate integration, the AFCFTA itself is composed of several protocols. It is a framework of rules for unification of the market, the single market of the 55 countries. But at the same time, it presents that structural transformation that was discussed earlier by yourself, Jody, and the earlier discussants that spoke about it. And the climate aspect and sustainability aspect runs across all these protocols. And it is not only in a chapter. So in the protocol on investment, we find that it is embedded from the preamble to the institutional aspects. And we have, of course, under the protocol on investment, the sustainable development chapter that has been mentioned even internationally, that it is one of the most forward-looking protocols or treaties that are binding in nature that contain the sustainability aspect, including the aspects of investor obligations, where investors have the obligation to ensure that climate action or climate adaptation measures are reflected in their everyday work. And one of the ODI studies actually mentioned this, that it is a world first to say that if the investor does not meet this, then the state party has a right to sue this investor. So it is really an obligation that we need to see. But even before you start thinking about that, then how are you supporting this investor to ensure that they are facilitated to operate and then to undertake this? In the trade facilitation logistics, we see that removing NTBs and streamlining border procedures reduce the cost, time, and emissions by strengthening the regional value chains and supply. So you can see that sustainability in our trade in goods documents. In investment regulation, of course, I've talked about the investment protocol that requires that state parties foster sustainable development, including environmental aspects and labor safeguards. And as well, under the investment regulation, we have the incentivization of sustainability, where across the continent, state parties have been asked to harmonize their incentives and then to see how they can draft and craft these incentives to attract sustainable investments, and particularly under low carbon emission SEZs, for example, and renewable energy and the like. Under the digital systems, the Digital Trade Protocol builds the foundation for traceability, evidence-based monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. This morning we talked about the challenge of the MRVs and the fact that it is actually very difficult for our producers to meet these standards. And so how do we make that easy under the Digital Trade Protocol? And also, what it does is it builds a transparent value chain system. So all essentials for compliance with emerging climate-linked trade measures are reflected under the digital system. So in short, on this first part, the AfCFTA is mainstreaming climate and sustainability into rules, into incentives and institutions that govern how Africa produces, how Africa trades, and how Africa attracts investment for sustainability. The second part, Jody, is now the interrelationship between the AfCFTA and AGII, the Africa Green Industrialisation Initiative. And as I'm speaking, my colleague, who is our counterpart on ground, Miss Joyce Kabui, is seated right across. She's the one who is actually championing AGII in Kenya, and she provides that support on ground at the office of the president. So if the AfCFTA gives us the unified rules and gives us the market access, what AGII does, it gives us now a pipeline of the projects and gives us how these projects are sourced, how these projects are financed, how these projects are syndicated, and how these projects can be developed. So its purpose is very practical. It converts climate ambition into bankable projects through project pipeline preparation platforms. And these pipeline project preparation platforms is not just done in isolation, but it is done with partners that have come together. So these partners are our development finance institutions, our commercial banks, and institutions of government that have said, we want to prepare projects. The problem around industrial projects in Africa is that 80% of it do not take off from feasibility stages. And when we had meetings with the commercial banks and the DFIs, they told us it is not really the problem around bankability per se, but it is how you prepare these projects. So we can wait and wait. We can wait for you to prepare them and bring for us. We see and we know that there is opportunity in these projects, but when they are not prepared in the manner in which speaks to how we can provide the financing, then we will not be able to. So then they came up with the idea to say, how can we then jointly do this project preparation? And then also with international partners like the Green Climate Fund, they have joined the Africa Green Industrialisation as a support partner. And as a support, they are saying that they would want to see how they can help to develop the core investment platform where these projects that have been prepared can then be placed, and any interested developer or interested financier can be able to find it, and there is now a matchmaking process within that co-investment platform. I know that a number of these co-investment platforms are being undertaken in the region, and so, but a continental one is now the one that is being prepared now. So it is in the process of preparation. So importantly, at the Climate Summit 2 in Addis Ababa in September, there was a cooperation framework that was signed by over 8 DFIs and commercial banks and the AFCFTA Secretariat with the champion of the Africa Green Industrialisation, who is His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, His Excellency William Ruto. And this cooperation framework operationalized now the discussions and engagements around how to practically take that initiative, which is a policy initiative, into actual investment on ground. So under this framework, African development finance institutions and commercial banks jointly announced mobilization of over $100 billion to support Africa's green industrial opportunity. And this was reported actually as one of the largest private sector-led climate finance mobilization in Africa's history. And we don't want that to just be an announcement. So after that, we have now had serious engagements where these DFIs are also giving us their pipeline of green projects. So it goes into the preparation phase, so that at the end of the year, for example, we can be able to say how we have translated that 100 billion into actual projects on the ground. So the AGII then provides that financing backbone to translate these climate rules to real production upgrades rather than the compliance aspects of penalties that we see. So most of these projects that we have seen and we are receiving are viable at continental levels. They are also viable at national levels, depending on the work that is being done. And AFCFTA then provides that scale by guaranteeing that market integration and that regulatory predictability. In an additional aspect, I know we spoke about the battery value chain, to say that we need to see beyond the national implementation to go into the regional value chain. We have the different countries that produce, for example, the critical minerals. How do you then translate into that value chain of the continent to say, if you produce cobalt, then where is the next part being done? So you do the value addition where you're producing it, but that input needs to be done in another part of the region, so that you then create that valuation and value addition, both on technology, not just only on the mineral, on technology, on human capacity. And then you have a product on the continent. So we are moving from national to continental. And with that, we have the rules of origin, of course, under the AFCFTA, that becomes now a very important tool, where they ensure that the beneficiation and component manufacturing quality and qualify for preferential access. This incentivizes then the regional value addition rather than the continued raw exports. And then finally on the working together, the AGII and the AFCFTA, there is a joint diplomatic function that we are seeing. Earlier, Ambassador Dr. Mohammed mentioned and said that the AFCFTA should provide us with now that vehicle of mobilizing heads of state, for example, of political high level to say, this is the direction we are going. Let us then trickle down. We have the political goodwill. How do we trickle down to implementation? So this is what now the two AGII and the FCFT is doing. So at the moment, the heads of state of the African Union in February mandated the AFCFTA Secretariat to support the implementation of the AGII. So AGII is now a program under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, giving it that continental leverage and to take advantage of that market access. So together, the AFCFTA and AGII give Africa both a political voice and an evidence base to negotiate issues around climate. And it is anchored not in abstract principles, but it is anchored in real industrial projects. What His Excellency the President said, we've now moved from discussions around the objectives. We are now on concrete actualization. And he actually gave a directive to say, by February, we need to see that the Secretariat of the AGII has been established and a project pipeline is on course. And we have already begun the identification of the projects. So compliance, like I've said, will marginalize Africa's export, but we need investment that is under the Africa Green Industrialization to transform the climate ambition into action. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rosalind. Indeed. So I hope that sort of provided you all with extremely helpful context. And, I've certainly learned a lot in terms of where you're headed next as well. I'd now like to pass over to our panelists. And if I can begin with you, Kaljin, if that's okay. What I wanted to ask you, Kaljin, because obviously you were at the Africa Climate Summit, you were at the signing where the DFIs got behind the AGII and it was signed, the signing ceremony and so on. But you're also working very hard to kind of square this circle whereby the kind of new trade-related climate measures that we know are coming downstream can better kind of support the AGII rather than kind of undermine it, if I can put it like that. So you've been working very hard in that area. So I'd really appreciate it if you could let the audience know more about the work that you're doing and where you see the biggest opportunities and where you also see the biggest threats.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jody, for giving us the opportunity to be here. I'm Carlijn. I am one of the two founders of Climate Action Platform Africa, CAPE for short. And we work to realize what we call climate positive growth. So that notion that Africa can achieve inclusive economic growth and job creation by being part of the climate solution. And what Rosalind just explained about AGII and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a crucial pillar of Africa's inherent climate competitiveness. Right? The continent has the potential to be the most cost-effective industrial and manufacturing hub in the world, capitalizing on its renewable energy potential. And it can do so to meet growing African demand, to drive import substitution, for example, through fertilizer production, but also to become a green factory for the world. And I know we've already spoken about mineral processing. You can think about agricultural processing, the production of sustainable fuels, and so on and so forth. And what's really exciting about all of that is that many of these opportunities are already potentially cost competitive on their own accord. And we're seeing that pipeline that Rosalind was talking about, and we're seeing innovation happening because almost everywhere in the world, it is now cheaper to install new renewable generation capacity than fossil fuel power capacity. So you don't have to be a climate lover or a tree lover to actually choose solar and wind over coal or gas. But of course, it will be that much more powerful, and Africa's competitiveness will be that much more enhanced and accelerated if it actually becomes costly to businesses to emit. And this is important for us to realize. We are in this climate problem because emissions are a schoolbook example of what economists would call negative externalities, right? One can privatize the gains and socialize the pains. I can make a profit by making a lot of emissions, and the rest of the world and society needs to deal with the consequences. And there are only two ways to deal with negative externalities: regulation, banning, and pricing. Making it expensive to emit accelerates the incentives for a green transformation for places that have a big industrial footprint, and it creates a stronger competitive advantage and potential for African locations that can do green from the start, right? That can build the green hydrogen factories to process their iron ore and make hot briquetted iron and steel and export that rather than just sending the rock across the world. And that's where those pricing mechanisms become really important. And they don't work exactly well. I know there's this shadow of the EU CBAM hanging over many of these discussions, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that is a set of rules that the... Oh, sorry. Did I break up? Jodie, can you still hear me? Oh, did we lose the room? I didn't lose my fellow panelist. I can still see Regis.
we can hear you loud and clear.
You can, Maria, but I'm not sure the room can. Okay, my colleague who's in the room is saying that there's network issues, and they're saying we lost you, but I think we lost them.
You're back.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah, we all of us panelists had lost you, so we were nicely talking to one another. Jodie, where did you lose me?
So you were kind of talking about the kind of cost competitiveness aspects, and you were getting into some of the examples of those.
Right. So I would like to get into a measure that I think has already been discussed in the morning and is often hanging over many of these discussions, and those are carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The European Union introduced the first, but there are many to come. And often people pretend that is very complicated. It's not all that complicated. It's like hard to comply with in practice, but the theory is quite simple. If you produce emissions when you produce a product, those embedded emissions, that's what they're called, you have to pay a price for when your product is imported into the European Union. And that is a complement to a set of mechanisms that the European Union has for its own industry, where its own industry needs to pay for emissions and needs to secure allowances for that. So far, so good. When it was announced, it was done so unilaterally, which is a problem. The MRV, as you discussed this morning, might be difficult, and that might actually practically lock suppliers out of being able to access these markets. But that is actually not the biggest problem. The biggest problem of CBAM is that many of the biggest emissions are actually excluded. For 3 out of the 6 products that are currently covered by CBAM, the scope 2 emissions, which are the emissions that are associated with the power that you use to produce these products, are not included. So let me give you a very tangible example. Aluminium. 70% of the emissions that are embedded in aluminium come from the power that you use to smelt the bauxite and the alumina. And because those emissions are not included, it means that aluminium made with the dirtiest power, really dirty coal-fired power, is treated as equally clean by CBAM as aluminium made with renewable energy. It doesn't pay a single cent more in levies. So there's really no incentive to switch to renewable energy. And conversely, where African producers already have that renewable energy, they can't really monetize it. So let me make that even more tangible. MIT has done detailed mapping and modeling of 153 aluminium smelters around the world, including Moselle. And prior to implementing CBAM, Mozal, the smelter in Mozambique, is cheaper than 80% of global smelters. It's actually a very efficient smelter. Once CBAM is implemented, as it's currently foreseen with only Scope 1, Mozal even becomes a tad bit more competitive. It's cheaper than 82% of global smelters. Not massively, right, from 80 to 82. But now watch. If we did incorporate the greenness of Mozal's power, if Scope 2 was incorporated, because Mozal runs on Mozambique's hydropower, Mozambique would be cheaper than 94% of all global aluminium smelters. That's an opportunity right there, right? There's an opportunity to begin with, but the opportunity that comes from recognizing the embedded emissions from power is an opportunity that is existential for the world and existential for Africa's green industrial potential. Now, I know that I've probably already spoken for longer than you wanted me to. I'm sure there's questions as to why is it not included and what can we do about it? But what I would really like to leave the audience with is that it really serves Africa's interest to understand these climate-related trade measures in enough detail to understand where they form a barrier, where they form an accelerant, to actually think about how can we be green and competitive and what kind of pricing mechanisms do we need and how do we lean into those, instead of only the response to a crudely unilaterally imposed set of measures. That was not very polite of the European Union, but that's not the problem. The problem is that they miss out on incentives for green industrialization. Back over to you in the room in Nairobi, Jody.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that very, very powerful last message. And I think it brings us in nicely to our next panelist, Maria, if you're online, if you can please join us, because right now we're talking a lot about territorial carbon accounting, which is the example of the EU CBAM. And it's one example of pricing carbon, but there are other pressures as well and other initiatives that are also seeking to price carbon. And I know that Maria, at your institute, perhaps you want to just kind of introduce yourself in the work that you do. You've been looking a lot about, you've been investigating a lot, in relation to the maritime pricing issues and bringing in this transportation angle. So if you are on the Maria, if you could kind of unmute.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
And show yourself. How can the carbon pricing in the shipping and how can? Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly? Hello, everyone. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So thank you, Jody and ODI for organizing this session, and I'm grateful for having been invited. As you may be aware, at the Africa Future Policies Hub, our work focuses on the nexus between trade and climate and how to make the green transitions work for Africa. I'm very happy to have heard earlier speakers, and I couldn't agree with you more on what has been said. In the maritime sector, we see similar pressures in relation to trade and climate. And why do we have these? Because the shipping industry is accountable for 3% of global emissions. And in line with the Paris Agreement, the entire global community is looking to decarbonize. But the shipping industry is taking the lead, at least from a global perspective, to reduce emissions from shipping. And how this is happening through the International Maritime Organization efforts to reduce emissions through its greenhouse gas reduction strategy, first introduced in 2018 and subsequently revised in 2023. Now, while the IMO process is still underway, you may be aware that in earlier this year in April, the IMO passed what we call the IMO Net Zero Framework after many years of deliberations, but it's still not in effect, and I'll speak to that soon. But in the meantime, we have the European Union taking leadership to reduce emissions from shipping. This was through the imposition of the EU ETS for shipping and the Fuel EU maritime regulations. How do these work? EU ETS for shipping essentially places a price on carbon emitted by ships, requiring ship owners to buy emissions allowances for every ton of carbon that they emit into the atmosphere in sailing. So for journeys or sailings between EU and African ports, 50% of those emissions would require allowances to be purchased and submitted to the EU at a relevant reporting date. What has that meant? It has meant that ship owners, often the shipping lines that deliver freight to Africa, have translated the costs of these emissions allowances into emissions surcharges, which charges are levied on top of freight for African cargo interests to pay. In Ghana, that has resulted in about $150 per 20-foot container in freight on imports and about $80 on exports. Now, if you take into consideration the fact that our African economies are largely import dependent and not so economically resilient, you have these freight increases resulting in about these surcharges accounting for about 10% increase in freight costs, with related increases or impacts in relation to inflation, cost of living, and on food security. And on the food security, let me just give you an example. Work done by the Food and Agriculture Organization shows that a 10% increase in freight costs can lead to a 3.5% increase in a country's food import bill. In Ghana, for example, that could be about $90 million a year in additional food cost increases just resulting from freight having gone up by 10%. So these emission surcharges have impacts for our economies. And the fact is that the reason being that the costs of low or zero to emission fuels are higher than traditional fuels. And the only way to compensate for this and to incentivize ship owners to adopt zero to a low emission fuels is to, as Caroline said, is to price the carbon, and hence paying for carbon means that you ideally should internalize the costs of the emissions. But that doesn't seem to be happening in Africa. The reason is that we don't control the ships, we don't own the fleet, and it's a seller's market here. Ship owners, shipping lines simply pass on the cost of compliance to us. In fact, pass on more than cost recovery plus, meaning there's a profit made from the imposition of emission surcharges, which profits do not necessarily go back to the European Union, but stay with the shipping lines, gravely disproportionately affecting Africa. So what's the way forward, or what can we do? I think in our view at AFPH, we believe that the multilateral process is the best way forward. And even though that may be slow or fraught with difficulties, as we've seen with the IMO Net Zero Framework adoption, it still is the best way forward, because at such fora, all countries have a voice, have an ability to input into the design of the framework, have ways to ensure that justice and equity are inbuilt into the measures, an opportunity which we sadly do not have when unilateral measures are passed. And it's simply about being impolite. It is a fact that we then have to be on the back foot trying to figure out how to reduce the DNIs or the disproportionate negative impacts that these have on us. So I think as African countries, we really should support the IMO process, engage fully. And that's where I like what was said about AFCFTA and AGII. And we at AFPH, we are happy to also work with Joyce and Ambassador Ali in that regard, because we believe that the IMO Net Zero framework and reduction of emissions from shipping creates opportunity for Africa to be the world's supplier of zero to low emission fuels. As green hydrogen potential on the continent is immense, and countries like Namibia, Morocco, Mauritania are well placed to benefit from this. And so when a negotiation is going on in the IMO, it is important that AFCFTA, AGII, Africa Union recognize the implications of these negotiations taking place in London on our trade, on our industry, and on our green industrialization ambitions. We cannot have what I see where IMO member states, African delegates go there uncoordinated without any input from our continental groupings who have the oversight, who have the global picture of where Africa wants to get to, the Africa we want. They, as the AU, the AFCFTA, AGII, need to translate these into the various international fora where negotiations are ongoing with climate, because it has an impact on our ability to realize our ambitions. Best way forward, I think also for Africa, we need to focus on trading with each other. Intra-regional trade gives us not only an opportunity to boost our economies, it also has an impact on reducing emissions globally, because the sailing distances from Tema to Cape Town, for example, or Durban is shorter than from Tema to Ningbo port in China. So if we trade with each other, we thereby reduce emissions because the trading distances are shorter. And so it's good for us. That's a way that we can both achieve our ambitions under AFCFTA, but also contribute to a better climate for us all. And yeah, I think so. We do need, these are the kind of thinking that we have at AFPH. And in addition to all of this, I think it's also a good time for us as Africa to start thinking seriously about developing an African fleet. Again, under AFCFTA, regional integration should also extend to the creation of a single maritime market. We need a maritime domain, a common exclusive maritime domain for Africa, where African ships carry African cargoes to African ports. Right now, we don't have that kind of integration, and therefore there are no advantages or incentives for Africans to own fleets, because we are competing with ship owners from across the world who can come in, go out with no advantages or any special incentives for African fleet. It will be a good time for us to think closely about a common African maritime corridor, one where we have green African ships carrying cargo to African ports. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Huge thank you, Maria, for that. I think we're able to really draw the links between the previous interventions. It's extremely helpful. I'd now like to turn to Professor Regis on the line with us. I realize that you're the only male on our panel, so I can get into trouble from that. But at least we have, I'm really delighted that you're here with us. And I think it would be helpful if you could pick up on the points that Maria made, in terms of the kind of IMO process for thinking about carbon pricing versus the unilateral CBAM EU measure, because I know you've been looking at this quite a lot in terms of the legal implications. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
If
I
you're
think
ready,
we
we're
lost
just
you at some
waiting.
point,
Thank
but
you.
I think I understood what you said in much more detail. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Jody and the ODI for extending the invitation and for allowing me to speak at this specific event. So one of the things which were mentioned here, and I totally agree and understand the angle from which this Caroline and Maria spoke. Basically, I wanted to address the rules-based international trade law system, how the implications of all these measures for the rules-based international trade law system and Africa's voice within this mechanism. So basically speaking, the WTO members are actually increasingly adopting climate-related trade measures or trade-related climate measures. I use them interchangeably for that matter. As you can see, the database of the WTO actually tells you about the skyrocketing and the increase of these measures from 2017. Because since the WHO was entered into force in 1997, they have seen a increased adoption of these type of measures for a number of reasons, or for obvious reasons. Climate deterioration is a common concern for mankind, right? And African countries themselves are taking measures to address these environmental challenges. However, what African countries actually have always advocated for is to use the multilateral platform to address multilateral problems, right? And they see the increasing use of unilateral measures as stifling and also sidelining these multilateral platforms. So, for instance, we mentioned the CBAMs. The EU is championing CBAMs. The UK CBAM is coming to force in 2027, sorry. The US CBAM probably is not yet, the bill has been tabled, but it's not yet adopted. But however, the US has also gone through the use of trade measures for climate purposes, even though one may still argue that they are not really meant for climate, but rather used in the context of geopolitical tensions with China. But however, the CBAM, for instance, comes in as a unilateral measure. So what developing countries have against CBAM is that they actually, of course, the goals are clear, the goals are noble, right? But the applications of the measures are the reasons why developing countries are challenging these measures. For instance, while we have the international environmental principles, such as the common but differentiated responsibilities in place, and the CBAMs are being implemented are being imposed or somehow implemented, let's say so, to pursue the COP20, the COP or the Paris Agreement objectives. They don't take into account some of the Paris Agreement requirements that says that countries should implement the Paris Agreement with in connection with their responsibilities in the global warming. So African countries are saying these CBAM, for instance, are being implemented with total disregard of this equity in global relations. So we need to make sure that not only these international environmental law principles are taken into account, but also WTO law rules are taken into account. For instance, unilateralism is not a way to go in the WTO. Not only that, how do you reconcile the common but differential treatment provisions with WTO provisions? It's through special and differential treatment. So if you are going to apply carbon border adjustment mechanism, this can only be done if it has gone through multilateral vetting. And WTO has institutions in place where these issues can be discussed, such as the Committee on Trade and Environment, for instance, right? So this is where these issues can be discussed and agreed. So this is what the WTO members, developing country WTO members have to say about that, because these measures are totally in violation of WTO rules. So apart from these CBAMs, you have the US, that is also using subsidies, domestic subsidies, in the name of environmental protection. You have the US Inflation Reduction Act, which everybody agrees is the most massive subsidies ever used by any country ever in this since the modern things. Let's say since the era of globalization. Let's put it that way. And what does it do? The IRA actually says that we want to incentivize the use of domestic input. If we are going to do so, we are going to give you subsidies if you use domestic input, domestic renewable resources to produce, or domestic raw materials to produce renewable products, for instance, right? However, these type of measures, again, somehow violate WTO rules. So when African countries are going to the MC14 next year, these are some of the issues they have on the table. For instance, the measures, like I said earlier, the IRA violates subsidies, they violate the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, the goods rule, they violate the trade-related investment measures rule, that is the TrCMs measures. Because this agreement says you cannot use local content requirement. However, the US is simply saying you can benefit from the subsidies only if you use domestic primary resources or resources which have been sourced from countries with whom the United States has a trade agreement. So this is being discriminatory on two counts. Not only it discriminates against other third parties' input, it also discriminates against countries that are not signatories of a trade agreement with the US. So this somehow incentivizes, or at least trying to use, this is a mechanism to trying to sideline, again, WTO subsidies rules. So developing countries have challenges going to MC14 in this regard, which they want to address. For instance, they cannot, and they don't want to, resort to unilateralism. They are asking for multilateral solutions in addressing climate issues. For instance, when they discuss subsidies rules, which the US is using, they're saying there used to be mechanism in the multilateral system which could assist everyone in pursuing green industrialization. For instance, they are saying Article 8, for instance, of the Agreement on Subsidies, which require countries to use subsidies for research and development, and also to pursue this type of green industrialization, went into extinction, because of the failure to reach a multilateral consensus to renew these mechanisms. So because the WTO agreement on subsidies used to prohibit export subsidies and local content subsidies. However, it used to allow, or subsidies of it used to allow, or which they call green subsidies, used to allow subsidies that were used to for the purposes of nurturing research and development. However, African countries are saying, for instance, going to MC14 next year, these are top of the measures which we need to reinstate. If we reinstate this, countries will probably not have to resort to unilateralism. Or if some do resort to unilateralism, at least we have some policy space to pursue green industrialization. Okay, so this is, for instance, from a WTO law perspective. Now, how can you leverage the AFCFTA and other domestic or African mechanism, endogenous mechanism whereby to pursue this African voice in this multilateral fora? So the AFCFTA itself has to be, the proper implementation of the AFCFTA can be used as a leverage in that regard in negotiations. Why? Because countries join trade agreements also, not only to liberalize markets among themselves, but also to use that as a power in the global economic governance. So a proper implemented AFCFTA can serve as that leverage in that countries willing or wishing to trade and also to in the African countries raw materials, we have to think about the type of negotiate the measures and the rules without you resorting again to unilateral measures like the CBAM and the IAA are actually doing now. So I'm simply arguing that in this context, African countries should accelerate the AFCFTA implementation and stop being simply exporters of raw materials and of course transform these materials locally and use that as a leverage to, let's say, to negotiate in this platform such as the WTO when it comes to the use of unilateral measures. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Emma-Jess. I think that's a very powerful. Yes, thank you so much. A very nice way to end that discussion. So I would now like to turn to Ndekwa, if you're ready, because I know we've been kind of talking about carbon emissions and so on, and green industrialization. But I know that the work that you've been pioneering really is also trying to get a greater focus on the bioeconomy and thinking about the role of nature and so on. So we'd really welcome your thoughts, in terms of how we can have a greater appreciation of the role of nature and the potential of nature to support the green industrialization drive as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. And it's been really refreshing to be in this space with like-minded individuals, especially when you're talking about trade. Different solutions are already coming up. We are also surfacing some of the challenges and the hard questions that we really need to put laser focus on. But maybe allow me to highlight just a few grounding realities, even as we talk about decarbonization and carbon and how we are connecting with the other players. First of all, I think we really need to have an appreciation of the fact that we will not be able to decarbonize our economies at this scale and speed that we are talking about if we are elevating the role of these discussions on our natural resources. That's just the first one. And trade has a very critical role to play in terms of advancing that aspect, which I will get to when we're talking about the bioeconomy. Now, the other aspect, and which has been coming out over and over again, I think we have been in a space for quite a long time now where we have been looking at nature's compliance obligation most of the times, or a public good that I can just exploit and we will all worry about the consequences later, rather than really looking at it as an economic engine. So that's what we want to do and potentially ground some of these conversations that we've been having. Now, let's make it very practical. If you're talking about the green energy transition, if you're talking about climate action, most of these aspects actually are linked to nature. So how do you use natural resources? How do you reach a lot about had a very of that food, the whole of the West Africa region? I seriously nodding her head. And out of cassava we can get bioenergy, for instance. So when we ecosystem and the whole value chain and what that means. Now, since we are trade people here in the room, let me also make it very practical. And picking numbers that are not very recent, so it means that these numbers have gone up. So by 2021, this is a project that UNCTAD has been driving for quite a while now. about 18 to 20% of global trade is related to biotrade. So it's biogoods, basically. So we are no longer, we're not talking about trade. We are no longer just talking about sustainability as a niche aspect. This is a whole component of our economic systems. And to ground it even further, when you talk about the bioeconomy, and we are seeing global players already reorganizing themselves about around the bioeconomy, we have the bioeconomy challenge that was just launched at COP30. Thankfully, we sit on that secretariat. South Africa has been pushing hard the priorities of the continent around the aspects of the bioeconomy and how we can tap into that market. It's because it has become very clear that the bioeconomy is essential for the survival of the economic systems in terms of where we are going. We have a session later on digital trade. To make it even more real, the bioeconomy as of 2030 is going to be even slightly higher digital trade globally. So that should give us insight into the kind of access that we can have. We can change the mic. It just gives us a glimpse into the market access and the market opportunities that the bioeconomy presents, essentially the opportunities that nature presents. Now, right there, for me, is a huge opportunity for the African continent. We have the land. We've been talking about value chain strengthening. We have the land, if you want to talk about agricultural systems and food system sovereignty and food system strengthening. We have the critical minerals as well, about 30% that lies on the continent. And then if you combine that with all the other ecosystems that we have, that is huge potential, but it will remain potential if we are not aligning industrial policy, if we are not aligning investment policy with nature positive and bioeconomy related aspects. So that there just grounds us in terms of, as we talk about trade and climate, we cannot afford not to think about the other side of the coin, which is nature. And for me, I think as a continent, we really need to start bringing these two together because you cannot achieve one in the absence of the other. There's another aspect that I would really love to highlight, and the opportunity as well that the bioeconomy presents. Rosalind took the words out of my mouth when she was talking about value chain strengthening. And it's not about thinking, I want to produce everything in Kenya or I want to produce everything in the DRC. It's about looking at our comparative and competitive advantages. So if we start thinking around how to capitalize the AFCFTA, focusing on our competitive and comparative advantages across the continent, we can easily add 15-20% premiums on the prices of the goods that we are sending out to the global market, or even just internally, because we are again consuming a lot of the goods that are coming from outside. Our market base is quite huge. There's an aspect around balancing industrial growth and sustainability. And for me, maybe we don't need to, we should actually be taking advantage of what I'm calling the let move advantage. So it may seem on one end that everything is against the African continent, but I think we are in a very, very strategic position if we just turn the tables around
and capitalize on what I'm calling the let mover advantage. So we do not have to follow the same script that the entire world followed in terms of the development pathway. We can leverage our resources more sustainably. We were talking about the factors of production with my friend there, land, labor, capital, human resources, and we have that in plenty. And sometimes what we are seeing, it's not really all about a money issue. It's not always a challenge of the money. It's about the business case and how we are packaging the business case. So I think we need, as a continent, to really capitalize on that let mover advantage and really capitalize on the bioeconomy as we talk about trade. As we go into MC14, some of the negotiations should also be able to tap into that. Now, how do we make this very, very practical, considering these are very high growth sectors, high value sectors that actually put sustainability as a competitive advantage and not a constraint? I think it's very important, and I would like to applaud the Africa Development Bank, who have now taken on leadership when it comes to aspects like natural capital accounting and what that means at the country level, what that means for climate resilience as well. But maybe the other thing we can do, how about we start without waiting for the WTO, without waiting for the European Union? You know, sometimes you need to think about, as we talk about reforming the WTO, how can we work on that? But at the same time, how can we work around the system? So we don't just look and wait for the WTO to change. What are those things that we can do internally? And so maybe we need to think about, and that's what Roslyn and the team, I think, are already doing. How do we establish aspects like nature positive economic zones? How, as a continent, do we take that leadership in terms of showing the world this is how it can be done, and this is how you can actually make gains out of it? I think the other aspect which has been coming up, and it's been more of outward facing, is an aspect around making sustainability profitable. So we need, when you're talking about private sector, when you're talking about value chain strengthening, the bottom line at the end of the day, I think the investors will just tell you what's in it for me, apart from my survival, apart from doing good to the environment, apart from meeting the climate targets, what's in it for me? And so that's the space where, again, we really need to get creative in terms of, for instance, tax incentives. How are we capitalizing on some of those things? We don't need the WTO to come and, help us to change our tax regimes, to pump, to help private sector pump more investment into climate resilient sectors. We don't need the WTO for the government to say, okay, I'm going to be using my procurement system to drive green growth. So there's the aspect of the WTO, but I think just to challenge us here is we also have options on the table which we need to capitalize on as we work on the WTO level. And then maybe just the last one, Jody normally talks about the green squeeze. I would like to add something. I think the continent is facing what I would call a triple squeeze, which is essentially just what Jody normally talks about. So we are facing the climate shocks. We are also facing tightening external finance ecosystems. And then there's the debt service burden that just keeps on growing more and more. And so I think the other aspect as we talk about trade is to think about, you cannot separate trade and investment. So we need to be very intentional around how are we designing our investment structures? Are we thinking about the whole ecosystem, what we call at Nature Finance, the Nature Finance stack? How does it look like at the macro level, at the big level, and how does it look like at the micro level? Because again, for the African continent, you're talking about the small players, the SMEs and MSMEs. those are the people that are actually powering the continent's growth. So we need to be very creative in terms of how we can capitalize and use trade to drive financing and investment that cuts across the entire ecosystem, both at the macro level, but also looking at the small players on the ground.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed, because you've left us with the kind of got so much to take away from your discussion, your intervention, and the previous speakers. Joyce, I don't know if you wanted to just pass the floor to you just quickly, if you wanted to say a few remarks from your side, given your work with the AGI. You're most welcome to join us here or take the mic from there. And then if you can all just kind of think of the questions that you would like to pose. You may want to pose them to a different speaker or make a more general comment, but we'll take one round of questions, let the panelists respond, and then we will break for coffee, because I can see that you're all really flagging and you kind of need a bit of a caffeine boost. So we will try and time. Thank you, Joyce. Most welcome to
the AFCFTA. And perhaps because it's already been covered in terms of the priorities that we want to aggregate the market, and of the areas that we're looking at is both the renewable energy, storage is becoming cheaper and more viable. So how does that also enable renewable energy? So a lot of work with Auda NEPAD that coordinates the work of the power pools. And how do we even change how we are trading power? In Africa is the cost of power. Our power is still very expensive, so we need to be fixing that. And the other thing that we're also working with the development finance institutions is the cost of capital. We are still paying interest in the double digits, while this capital is coming into the continent at single digit. So how do we change that, even looking at domestic or national level, where sovereign pension funds come in to fund industrialization? So our focus for the next year is we'll be doing a lot of knowledge in terms of then mapping the opportunities. Fertilizer, again, has already been spoken on, where agriculture comes. We are very, sub-Saharan Africa is very under-fertilized. We are using, I think I remember the last number was 17 kgs per hectare against a global average of about 70. China is already, I think, at 135 kgs. So there's lots of room in that market, which means we want to address food security for a growing population. That's an immediate opportunity. Maria already talked about the maritime opportunity. The other thing we're looking at is sustainable aviation fuels. And these are things that we can produce on the continent because we have mentioned land, renewable energy resource, workforce, very many young people in the room here. So a lot of knowledge in presenting this opportunity to even DFI. So because the time you talk green hydrogen to AFDB, they say, yes, we will invest the early capital, but they're not yet putting the capital into an actual big project. So how do we get the money people to actually see they are now, they're not our future. It's immediate, the same with electric mobility. So, and we look forward to collaborating and getting that support. There's that political leadership. It's continental-wide, AGII, all, but we currently have about 15 countries that are quite active. They've already started talking about reviewing their industrial policy to include green industrialization. And green industrialization, we're looking at it. We're also in the process of working with the financial partners to define the taxonomy for green industrialization. It means different for different jurisdictions. For instance, when it comes to electric mobility, the cars that are using EVs, they were not manufactured using renewable energy, but they're helping us reduce emissions on our roads. So how do we even define green industrialization? We still have not agreed on a common definition of that, which again goes to the standards and certification for these same products. So that's the bulk of the work that we'll be doing in 2026. And we're really looking forward to deepening collaboration, because I think we're now in that takeoff space, like we are really going into actual pipeline development. And yeah, I think that's what I'll add. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed, Joyce. So if we can take some questions, and that would be excellent. So yes, I can see 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so quite a few questions. I've got several microphones.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Katingi. I am an economist and an aspiring policy professional. So I'm from the Economic Students Association of Kenya. And my question particularly is on promoting the green economy while still promoting free trade, right? So with these green economy measures, how could African countries employ, or rather, what measures could African countries employ in aligning their global standards for green economy with their own standards in an aim to limit the creation of trade barriers as a result of, converting into the green economy? Thank you.
So we will have to go really quick with the questions because we are running out of time. Thank you.
I'm PAQ, Ruth Kirema Barry. I work for a family company that deals both with minerals and construction. And the comment really is for Carolyn. I'm not sure if she's still online. But the construction department have found that there's a lot of support from ICF to build a green-friendly and property that's supporting the local economy. And this is the first time private equity have actually applied for ICF funding and has been very successful. So I'm very encouraged in both hands working together, both private companies and the ICF. Thank you.
My name is Kiaga Shanja from the African Society for International Law. And my question for the panel is on the EU CBAM. It provides for its carbon. This amount will be deducted from the amount of tax due under CBAM. And of course, this would retain the much needed revenues domestically. So should African economies create a common carbon taxation mechanism under, for instance, the AfCFTA? I know for a fact South Africa has a domestic carbon taxation, but I'm not aware of any other African countries that have the same.
Yeah, and then here. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Soit from the University of Cambridge. Just to follow up with the CBAM conversation, a question to the Rosalind from AFTA. What are the negotiations that perhaps AFTA is having on CBAM, because it's meant to start in 2026? And there's a lot of ambiguity on the implications of CBAM on some African countries. So whilst Kenya is one of the countries that perhaps will be affected least by the CBAM, because we have renewable energy, there are countries that are going to be affected. And perhaps maybe you could shed light on some of the conversations that you had in Rwanda. Yes, thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So 1, 2, 3, and then one gentleman at the back, and then I'll pass to the panel, and in 2 minutes if you could respond. But great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insightful presentations you've made. My name is Rosemary Mwanza, and I am a legal researcher focusing on how environmental law can be strengthened or operationalized to respond to corporate environmental harm. So most of the work I do is centered on right holders, like right holders are the main focus of concern. So my question is informed by that perspective. And within this theme, I have been particularly interested in ways in which climate and environmental standards developed in the global north sometimes impose structural and compliance burdens on African countries. And a recent example is the CSDDD that has raised similar concerns. So against this background, I would like to ask, from a legal and institutional perspective, how should the AFTA integrate principles of equity and differentiated responsibilities when responding to CBAM, so that carbon pricing mechanisms do not entrench structural inequalities in African trade and industrialization? Thank you.
Lots of questions on CBAM. One more, and then we'll pass Rosalind, Ndika, Kaljan, if you're still on the line, Maria, and Regis. So thank you so much. Huge thanks for staying with us.
Okay. Unfortunately, my question also goes back to Rosalind. So interesting conversations you're having on the progress that AFTA is making on green industrialization. Amazing steps, to be honest. But my question is, I just sit down and wonder, when African economies, many of which are agricultural, climate sensitive, is AFTA at any point looking at Africa as victims of climate change, and what is the progress that you're trying to make as AFTA when it comes to addressing such situations and trade liberalization in the continent?
I'm waiting extremely patiently. If you can be really quick, but we've had lots of questions on CBAM, lots directed to Rosalind.
Thank you. Great conversations. Dan Bimdach is my name, from the Ministry of Investments, Trade and Industry. And I also work for the Kenya National Trading Corporation. So my question is one on the roles of state trading agencies like KNTC, and whether it can tie suggesting sector more than influence or catalyze such initiatives. Last, sustainability.
We lost our host.
It looks that way, yes. It was going that way when the gentleman started asking his question, because it became more of a rap artist than a question in how it broke up.
I think they're back. Maybe they're
back.
So,
yeah. Yes.
Okay. So generally, sustainability, how can it be a compliance mechanism, but not a cost implication, and also the role of state trading agencies? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very many questions. Indeed, it still shows the center relevance of the Africa continent of free trade. Allow me to answer them in bulk, right? Because they are almost all interrelated. And I will begin by saying that your questions touch on the fact that Africa's competitiveness really depends on whether climate transition costs are financed or simply imposed change that it's having on Africa. We see the effects on infrastructure distractions. We see the effects on the climatic changes, and it is affecting the productivities. We are seeing challenges in terms of food security. So the conversation that the Council of Ministers have had around this is the important part is to actually demand for financing, and financing that goes to aid our infrastructure, that goes to aid the aspects of food storage, for example, the aspect of smart agriculture. So we have the elements on ground, but the limitation is now the area of financing. So that is what is being discussed. And around the financing part, the AFDB has taken the step, and the Afrexim Bank, in terms of saying how do we then support the financing of infrastructure, and infrastructure that also has climate aligned to it. So those are the conversations that are happening. And then we also have a component around the regional value chains that are very specific to agriculture. So the specificity is to say, where are the challenges that we are facing? And so what core development do we need to have on the value chains? So we have, for example, Zimbabwe that produces grain that feed the entire continent. But you will find that during the climatic, because of the climatic changes, we have the grains that is available in Zimbabwe, but those grains are not, we do not see them in the parts of the continent that are experiencing drought, for example. And when we then get that grain out, we have 40% losses. So then it was value addition of that grain, and then the infrastructure development to ensure that there is movement of that particular grain, even both grains, wheat, maize, and the rest. How does it move across the continent? So that is a conversation. So then the second part is to say, in response to CBAM and in response to climate discussions, there are three elements that the AFCFTA is looking at. The first is scale before perfection. So this is the regional value chain that we have been speaking about. So the regional value chains then become the buffers. And so the AFCFTA integration allows the Africa farms to source intermediate inputs regionally rather than from long high emissions shipping routes, to achieve scale efficiencies that reduce per unit carbon intensity and compliance cost, and create regional industrial clusters that make technology upgrades really feasible. The second on that is investment-led transition, not compliance-led transition. So that speaks to some of the questions that has been asked. So the carbon adjustment policies assume that farms already have this. Most African farms do not. So the work that we are doing under AGII responds to this mismatch. The response is that we are building continental project preparation capacities that integrate industrial upgrading, plus climate resilience, plus export competitiveness. And we are also aggregating projects so that DFIs can deploy matching finance rather than isolated grants. And so, and the third on this, and then I yield the floor, is the differentiated sequencing. So Africa must decarbonize first where competitiveness gains exist. What are our priorities? Are we decarbonizing just because we've been asked to decarbonize and because we have to meet the standards? What are our national priorities like? Our national priorities right now is agriculture. Our priority is renewable energy. Those are some of the areas where we need to put in the effort of both policy and financing. So we need to then look at this. We need to delay costs in terms of cost transitions in sectors where alternatives are not commercially viable yet. So let's look at where we are competitive and where we have the priority. So uniform decarbonization timetables, they penalize the early stage industrializers. So we need to say, Africa, where do we want to start? Not with everything, but where we want to start. So this is a conversation, really. There are pretty many other things that I have put down here in terms of what we can look at. For example, mutual recognition under the AFCFTA, having the regional MRVs, for instance, the certification platforms, the revenue recycling diplomacy, for example. So we need to look at how we recycle back the revenue into the continent.
You can all talk more over coffee shortly. So Ndika, over to you.
So I'll keep it very brief because again, Ross has really made it very comprehensive. But I would like to emphasize competitive and comparative advantage. We cannot afford not to look at what are our competitive advantages and what are our comparative advantages as a continent, even before we go looking out. And then when it comes to the aspect of financing, one of the biggest things we are seeing is the availability of investable projects and how the business case is actually being presented to the finance ecosystem. So for the finance ecosystem, they're very much aware that this is a survival aspect for them. And they are, most of them, the ones we are talking to at Nature Finance, open to providing the capital, but sometimes the projects do not meet the investment tickets. So sometimes it does not become economically viable for them to put in some of the financing. And that's why it's very important to think through what stage of transition are we and what kinds of capital do we need, and then how do we approach them across that financing cycle. So risk is a big one, and then competitive and comparative advantage is also very important.
Thank you so much. Carl-Jim, over to you, then Maria, then Regis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I won't repeat all of the excellent things that have been said by the ladies so far. I would like to actually build on that. So both of them really emphasize the importance of African agency and an African agenda, and Africa defining what it needs based on its comparative and competitive advantage and its development outcomes. And from that starting point, engaging and choosing. And that very much ties to the question the gentleman asked, and I'm so sorry, his name escaped me, about carbon tax and a uniform carbon tax. And with that importance of specific agency in mind, my suggestion would be not to move to a uniform carbon tax, because not for all African countries does it make a similar amount of sense, right? There are a lot of African countries where the vast majority, actually almost all African countries, the vast majority of emission comes from land use change by smallholder farmers who have no choice but to clear new land to feed their families, and urban transport, urban mass transit, matatus, and those kind of things. Putting a carbon tax on that will only make life more expensive for people who have no alternative choices. So what will you be doing? You're really struggling to collect taxes because it's really hard to collect taxes in that distributed fashion. You're penalizing the poorer part of your population who has no alternative. And you're actually not in any way shifting your economy to be greener, because there is not an alternative that those people can action. And that makes it very, very hard to tell your population there's a green future, because you've just made their daily life more expensive. So as and when African countries consider carbon taxes as a mechanism to onshore the levies under CBAM, they have to be laser focused in their design. So I gave you the example of Moselle in Mozambique. It's the single biggest industrial player. If Mozambique put an industrial carbon tax in place with a minimum sort of emission threshold, you can imagine that you design it in such a way that it kind of only hits Moselle, which would be perfect because it allows you to onshore the European levy and get it in Mozambique as domestic resource mobilization without hitting the smallholder farmers or the urban commuters. But that is a very country-specific choice that needs to be driven by which industries have a relation to countries that impose CBAM, what incentive do you have to actually onshore those revenues, and how can you do it in such a way that it doesn't hurt the parts of your economy you don't want to hurt, and builds on that competitive and comparative advantage. So as much as in many areas African collaboration is indispensable, I think a blanket harmonization of a uniform carbon tax would have Africa cut in its own flesh instead of benefit.
Maria, over to you, please. 2 minutes, thank you, to close, and then we just...
Thank you. Yeah, many questions. I'm not sure that I can address any specifically, but I'll just use these comments to wrap up my thoughts on this very important conversation. And I think for me, the key takeaway is that Africa must approach these climate initiatives or measures from a coordinated position collectively. We need a Team Africa approach, and we need leadership on the continental level, whether it's the AU Commission or AFCFTA. We need to see that leadership, because otherwise a fragmented approach of Africa, either whether it is CBAM or EU ETS or deforestation regulations, leaves us not in a very strong position to bargain and to negotiate and to ensure that the outcomes are mutually beneficial for our economies as well. And I would like to urge the AFCFTA, Ambassador Lee, who is doing a very good job already, AGII, to look at the political approach to Africa's negotiations in these climate fora, because we can't do this. We need a Team Africa approach. We need to do this together, not treat them in isolation or in silos, but coordinate our response. Because that's the only way we can work together. If you think that on the African continent, the EU ETS alone could be transferring $4 billion to the EU Innovation Fund per year, $4 billion to the EU's Innovation Fund per year on emission surcharges alone, that's $4 billion from Africa to Europe. And all monies that accrue in the Innovation Fund are spent only in greening the EU. So if a lady from AFCFTA is talking about recycling some of these revenues, that conversation should be had between the AU and the EU in fora like the Luanda Summit. But having scanned some of the outcome documents from that event, I wonder if such conversations actually took place. So I would urge that we have these conversations, and we should find the political will and the courage to address some of these conversations, difficult as they may be, but that's the only way to ensure that the transition is actually equitable, that it reflects the spirit of the Paris Agreement, and that it works for all of us on this climate, because we are all collectively suffering from it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maria. Regis.
Okay. Let me speak again. As a lawyer, I always want to bring back the rules-based multilateral system and also the AFCFTA rules-based system into the picture. So, CBAMs are unilateral measures. Not only are they unilateral, but they're also extraterritorial in the sense that they try to regulate conduct in other states, and are also embedded, also trying to influence the ways in which goods are produced in jurisdictions that are not EU jurisdictions. So from a multilateral system, this is challenging in that regard. So we cannot exclude WTO from the conversation at all, because again, this is where these rules are negotiated and agreed between the WTO member states. Now, coming to the, so this is what the AFCFTA or African countries should discuss when going forward, also at the MC14 next year, to try to make sure that these rules take into account the forum where they should be agreed, that is the WTO forum, where rules should be taken by consensus. Now, talking about the AFCFTA industrial revolution, of course, the AFCFTA countries are using special economic zones. SEZ are being used on the continent for industrial policies, reasons. But how then to make sure that these are used in a way that nurture industrialization is a challenge also. Are you treating goods produced in this SEZ as origin or as originating in these countries, or are these goods made for exportation is something that we should agree upon in a way that everybody agrees for. So because again, there may be discrepancies between regional economic communities as to how you treat these goods. You treat them all as originating goods, meaning they can be traded among AFCFTA state parties as though they were manufactured within a jurisdiction of these goods, of these countries, or are you going to refuse, deny them originating status, meaning they're going to be traded, they're going to be manufactured, but meant for exportation? So we need to make sure that we discuss this also as a rule-based mechanism on the continent as well. So this is a dialogue between WTO and EFCFTA state parties as well.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So I just cannot thank you all enough. You've really given us so much to reflect on, really, really powerful, strong interventions. So a huge thank you to you all. We will take a very short coffee break. The coffee is just outside. We have kind of 10 minutes between now and the next session, which will be on digital. So please all do stay with us for the final session. But a huge thank you and a round of applause to all of our panelists for joining us here today. And we'll keep the conversation going with you all. Thank you.